6 years ago, Thomas Hargrave banished Emily, pregnant and alone, to the slums. Now, a street urchin with his green eyes stares up at him, his son, alive, and Thomas's world shatters. Hi, lovely soul. If you're enjoying this story, a like or subscribe would help more than you know. And if you feel comfortable, tell me where you're watching from. I smile every time I read your comments. Chapter 1. The Banishment. The afternoon light filtered through the tall windows of Lord Thomas Hargrave's study, casting long shadows across the mahogany desk where he sat reviewing correspondence. Outside, London hummed with the sounds of carriages and street vendors, but within these walls, everything was ordered, controlled, perfect. Thomas picked up the latest letter from Lord Blackwood, reading it for the third time that day. The railway investment opportunity was extraordinary, a chance to secure not just his financial future, but to cement his position among London's most influential men. Blackwood's words were carefully chosen. This venture requires partners of impeccable reputation and unquestionable character. I can think of no one more suitable than yourself, Hargrave. Impeccable reputation. The words seemed to glow on the page. A soft knock interrupted his thoughts. "Come in," he called, setting the letter aside. The door opened, and Emily stepped into the study. She wore her usual simple grey dress, her chestnut hair pinned neatly beneath her cap. But there was something different about her today. Her hands trembled slightly as she closed the door behind her, and she wouldn't quite meet his eyes. "My lord," she said quietly, then caught herself. When they were alone, she never used his title. "Thomas, might I have a word? A private word?" He gestured to the chair across from his desk, watching as she crossed the room. She moved through his study with the ease of familiarity, straightening a stack of papers that had gone askew, her fingers brushing the edge of his desk in that unconscious way she had. She knew this room as well as he did. She knew how he took his tea without asking. She knew which books he reached for when he was troubled. For a moment, seeing her there, Thomas felt his carefully maintained composure soften. The months of stolen moments, whispered conversations, the way she looked at him as though he were more than just his title, it all rushed back. Then he remembered himself, straightened in his chair, became Lord Hargrave once more. "What is it, Emily?" She sat on the edge of the chair, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. I've been trying to find the right words for weeks now." She took a shaky breath. "There's no delicate way to say this, so I'll simply say it. I'm with child." The words hung in the air between them like a physical thing. Thomas felt the world tilt. His first thought was absurdly practical. How far along? His second thought was of Blackwood's letter, still sitting on his desk. Impeccable reputation. "Are you certain?" His voice sounded strange to his own ears, distant, cold. "Yes." Emily's hands twisted in her lap. "I'm certain. I've known for nearly a month, but I wanted to be sure before I—" She looked up at him then, and he saw hope warring with fear in her brown eyes. "I know this complicates things, Thomas. I know it's not what we planned, but we could find a way. Perhaps a quiet marriage, somewhere outside London, or marriage." The word came out sharper than he intended. She flinched but pressed on. "We could say I'm a distant cousin, recently widowed. No one would question." "Stop!" Thomas stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. His mind was racing, spiraling through possibilities, each one worse than the last. His father's voice echoed in his memory. "The Hargrave name is everything. Guard it above all else." He thought of the railway investment, of Blackwood's careful emphasis on impeccable reputation. He thought of Lady Helena Ashworth, whom his mother had been pushing him to court. He thought of the whispers that would follow him through every drawing room, every gentleman's club, for the rest of his life if this became known. A maid. He'd gotten a maid pregnant like some common scoundrel. The shame of it burned through him, and in that moment he couldn't separate his anger at himself from his anger at the situation, at her, at everything that was about to come crashing down around him. "This is—" He turned away from her, staring out the window without seeing anything. "This is impossible. Thomas, please, don't." He held up a hand, still not looking at her. "I need to think." The silence stretched between them. Emily remained in her chair, her breathing shallow, waiting. Thomas gripped the window frame, his knuckles white, his mind a battlefield where pride and conscience fought for dominance. He thought of his father, dead these 5 years, who had drilled into him the importance of the family name, the weight of their position. He thought of his mother, who would look at him with such disappointment. He thought of the scandal, the whispers, the knowing looks, and beneath it all, quieter but insistent, he thought of Emily, the way she laughed at his terrible jokes, the way she'd taught herself to read better simply because he'd lent her books, the softness in her eyes when she looked at him, as though he were worthy of being loved. But that quiet voice was drowned out by the roar of fear and shame. "You'll have to leave," he said finally, his voice flat. Behind him, Emily made a small sound, not quite a gasp, not quite a sob. "Leave," she repeated. "Thomas, I don't understand. I thought—" "You thought what?" He whirled to face her and saw her recoil from whatever she saw in his expression. "That I would throw away everything my family has built? That I would become a laughingstock? I thought you cared for me," her voice cracked. "I thought what we had meant something to you. What we had was a mistake." The words came out like weapons, meant to wound, meant to drive her away before his resolve could crumble. "A moment of weakness that I deeply regret." Emily stood now, her face pale except for 2 spots of color high on her cheeks. "You don't mean that. Thomas, please, think about what you're saying. I've thought of nothing else since you walked through that door." His voice rose, fury and fear tangling together. "Do you understand what this would do to me? To my family's name? I'm about to enter a business partnership worth more than you could earn in a lifetime, and it requires—" He stopped himself, but too late. "Requires what?" Emily's voice was quiet now, dangerous. "An impeccable reputation." The way she said it, with such bitterness, made something twist in his chest. But he pushed it down, buried it beneath layers of self-preservation and pride. "Get out," he said coldly. "Take your shame and leave my house. I'll provide a sum enough to see you through, but I never want to see you again. Do you understand? Never. I loved you." The words were barely a whisper. "I thought you loved me." Thomas said nothing. He couldn't. If he spoke now, if he acknowledged the truth in her words, everything would fall apart. So he remained silent and watched as understanding slowly dawned in her eyes. "I see." Emily's voice was hollow now, all the hope drained from it. "I was such a fool. Emily, don't." She held up a shaking hand. "Don't say my name. Don't pretend there's any kindness left in you." She moved toward the door, her movement stiff, mechanical. "I'll be gone within the hour." "Wait." Thomas reached into his desk drawer, pulled out a small leather purse. He set it on the desk between them. £3. It's all I can spare without raising questions." Emily stared at the purse as though it were a serpent. £3, she repeated flatly. "For 6 years of service. For—" she pressed a hand to her stomach. "For your child. Take it or leave it." For a moment, he thought she would leave it, would walk out with nothing just to spite him. But survival instinct won out. She snatched up the purse, and the look she gave him was pure contempt. "I hope it was worth it," she said. "Your precious reputation, your business ventures. I hope they keep you warm at night, Lord Hargrave." She wrenched open the door and nearly collided with Mrs. Pemberton, the housekeeper, who had clearly been hovering in the hallway. The older woman took one look at Emily's face, then at Thomas, and her expression hardened into something cold and condemning. "Mrs. Pemberton," Thomas said, forcing authority into his voice. "Miss Shaw is leaving our employment. Please see that she collects her things and is escorted from the premises. My lord." Mrs. Pemberton's tone was perfectly correct, perfectly proper, and utterly disgusted. She placed a gentle hand on Emily's shoulder. "Come along, dear. Let's get you sorted." Emily allowed herself to be led away, but at the threshold, she turned back one last time. "I'll tell your child you died," she said. "It will be kinder than the truth." Then she was gone, and Thomas was alone. He stood frozen in the middle of his study, listening to the fading sound of footsteps in the hallway. After a moment, he moved to his desk on unsteady legs and sank into his chair. His hand trembled as he reached for the brandy decanter, poured himself a generous measure. The liquor burned going down, but it did nothing to fill the sudden hollow feeling in his chest. Blackwood's letter still lay on his desk, those words glowing with promise. Impeccable reputation, unquestionable character. He'd preserved his future. He'd protected the Hargrave name. He'd made the only sensible choice. So why did he feel as though he'd just destroyed something infinitely precious? Thomas drained his glass and poured another, staring at the door through which Emily had disappeared. The afternoon light was fading now, shadows lengthening across the floor, and in the growing darkness, he could almost pretend the hollowness in his chest meant nothing at all. Almost. Chapter 2. Survival's Price. The boarding house on Copper Street smelled of boiled cabbage, unwashed bodies, and despair. Emily stood in the narrow hallway, her carpet bag clutched in one hand, £3 weighing heavy in her pocket, Thomas's parting gift, his final insult. The landlady, a wizened woman with suspicious eyes, had quoted her 6pence a week for a bed in a shared room. 6 weeks of shelter, then. 6 weeks to find work, to figure out how to survive in a world that had no place for a pregnant woman, with no husband and no references. "Well," the landlady demanded, "you taking it or not? I've got 3 other girls wanting that bed." Emily forced herself to nod. "I'll take it." The room she was shown to held 4 narrow beds crammed so close together there was barely space to walk between them. The walls were thin enough that she could hear a baby wailing in the next room, and beneath that, a man's angry voice, slurred with drink. The window was cracked, stuffed with rags that did little to keep out the November cold. This was her world now. Emily set her carpet bag on the bed that would be hers and sat down carefully. The mattress was thin, lumpy, and smelled of mildew. Through the wall, the argument next door was escalating, punctuated by the sound of something breaking. The baby's cries grew more frantic. She wrapped her arms around herself, suddenly and violently cold in a way that had nothing to do with the temperature. How did I get here? But she knew. She knew exactly how. 14 years old, standing in the kitchen of Hargrave House for the first time. Everything had seemed so grand, so impossibly clean and orderly. Her mother had gripped her shoulders, looked her straight in the eye. "Keep your head down and your virtue intact, Emily. That's how you survive in a great house. The moment you forget that, you're lost." Emily had nodded solemnly, not fully understanding. She'd been so young, so naive, so certain that hard work and good behavior would be enough. She hadn't counted on green eyes and a kind smile, hadn't counted on stolen moments in the library, on whispered conversations that made her feel seen, truly seen, for the first time in her life, hadn't counted on love, or what she'd mistaken for it. A door slammed somewhere below, jolting Emily back to the present. One of her roommates had returned a girl who looked barely older than Emily herself, her face hard, despite her youth. "New, are you?" the girl asked, not unkindly. "First rule, keep your valuables on your person. Second rule, don't ask questions. Third rule, mind your own business and expect everyone else to mind theirs." "Thank you," Emily managed. The girl shrugged and threw herself onto her own bed, asleep within minutes despite the noise surrounding them. Emily lay down fully clothed, pulling the thin blanket up to her chin. The cold seeped through the walls, through the floorboards, into her very bones. In the next room, the baby had finally quieted, but now she could hear a woman coughing, deep and rattling. She pressed her hand against her stomach, still flat, still showing no sign of the life growing within. "I'll find a way," she whispered into the darkness. "I promise you, I'll find a way." The next 3 days were a lesson in humiliation. Emily tried the big houses first, the ones that might need a scullery maid or a laundress, but without references, without anyone to vouch for her character, the housekeepers turned her away before she could even finish explaining. One took in her neat appearance, her proper speech, and narrowed her eyes suspiciously. "What's a girl like you doing without references?" she demanded. "What did you do to get dismissed?" Emily had no answer that wouldn't make things worse. She tried the factories next, the textile mills that were always looking for workers. But the foreman took one look at her, really looked, and she saw recognition dawn in his eyes. He could tell, somehow, perhaps something in the way she carried herself, or perhaps he'd simply seen too many desperate women to be fooled. "Can't use you," he said flatly. "Come back after the baby," as though it were that simple. By the 4th day, Emily's £3 had dwindled to £2.08. The boarding house took its weekly due. Food, cheap as she tried to keep it, still cost money. And winter was coming, proper winter, the kind that killed people in the slums. She was standing outside a bakery, breathing in the warm scent of bread she couldn't afford, when a voice spoke behind her. "You're new to Copper Street." Emily turned to find a woman watching her, perhaps 50 years old, with iron-grey hair and a face lined by hard years but not unkind. She wore a simple dress and apron, both worn but scrupulously clean, and carried a basket of laundry. "I am," Emily admitted warily, remembering her roommate's advice about minding her own business. "Thought so. I know all the regulars." The woman studied her with shrewd eyes. "You're in trouble." It wasn't a question. Emily's hand moved instinctively to her stomach, and the woman's expression shifted not to judgment, but to something like recognition. How far along? There seemed little point in lying. 3 months, perhaps, maybe 4. And the father? Gone. The word came out bitter. He's dead to me. The woman nodded slowly, as though this confirmed something she'd already suspected. I'm Mrs. Dawson. I run a laundry service from my rooms 2 doors down from the boarding house. It's hard work, and the pay is barely enough to keep body and soul together, but it's work. And I don't ask questions. Emily felt something loosen in her chest. Hope, dangerous and fragile. I'm a hard worker. I can sew. Can you keep up with piecework? Mending, mostly. Some sewing. My eyes aren't what they were, and I've more work than I can handle. Yes, I can do that. Mrs. Dawson shifted her basket to her other hip. Come round tomorrow morning, early. We'll see how you manage. But I'll tell you now, girl, this won't be easy. The work is endless, and the pay is barely enough. You'll ruin your hands and strain your eyes, and at the end of it, you'll still be poor. But I'll survive, Emily said quietly. My baby will survive. Something flickered in Mrs. Dawson's eyes, pain, old and deep. Yes, she said, you'll survive. I'll make certain of it. Mrs. Dawson's rooms were cramped and steamy, filled with the smell of soap and the heat from constantly boiling water. But they were clean, and the work, while backbreaking, was steady. As the days turned into weeks, Emily learned Mrs. Dawson's story in fragments, offered during brief rests between loads of laundry. I had a daughter once, Mrs. Dawson said one afternoon, her hands never stopping their work. Pretty thing, clever, caught the eye of a merchant's son. He promised her the world, and she believed him. Emily's hands stilled on the shirt she was mending. She was 16 when she got pregnant. He denied it, of course. Said she was a liar and a whore. My girl. She didn't survive the birth. The baby neither. Mrs. Dawson's voice was matter-of-fact, but her hands trembled slightly. So, you'll survive, Emily Shaw. You'll survive because I'll make certain of it. I couldn't save my daughter, but I can help you. Emily's throat tightened. I don't know how to thank you. Don't thank me. Just survive. That's thanks enough. As winter deepened and Emily's condition became harder to hide, they worked out a system. Emily would take in mending and sewing that could be done in her room, away from prying eyes. Mrs. Dawson would claim the work as her own, collecting payment and passing most of it on to Emily. What will you tell people? Mrs. Dawson asked one evening. When the baby comes, people will ask questions. Emily had been thinking about this for weeks, turning it over in her mind during the long hours of sewing. I'll tell them my husband died, that I'm a widow, and when the child asks about his father, Emily's hand moved to her stomach, feeling the first flutter of movement beneath her palm. Life, real and undeniable. I'll tell him his father was a good man who loved us. I'll tell him, her voice caught. I'll tell him that his father died before he was born, but that he would have been proud, that he had his father's eyes. It was a lie, but it was a kind lie, a protective lie. Her child would never know the truth that his father had turned them away, had chosen reputation over love, had valued £3 more than their lives. That's wise, Mrs. Dawson said quietly. Children don't need to carry their parents' sins. Late that night, long after Mrs. Dawson had gone to bed, Emily sat by candlelight in her corner of the shared room, mending a gentleman's shirt. Her fingers moved automatically, the stitches small and even despite the dim light. Her roommates snored around her, and outside, the slums settled into their restless nighttime rhythm. She paused in her work, pressing one hand to her stomach. The baby moved beneath her palm, stronger now, more insistent. Real. You are wanted, Emily whispered into the darkness. Whatever else happens, whatever hardships we face, you need to know that. You are wanted. You are loved. She bent back to her work, her eyes stinging with tears she refused to shed. Thomas Hargrave had made his choice. He'd chosen his pristine reputation, his business ventures, his comfortable life. But she would make a different choice. Every day, every stitch, every coin earned, it was all a choice. To survive, to persevere, to love this child enough for 2 parents. The candle flickered, casting dancing shadows on the wall. Emily's hands never stopped moving. That will be enough, she told her unborn child. It has to be enough. And in the cold, cramped room that smelled of poverty and desperation, Emily Shaw chose to believe it. Chapter 3. The Cost of Choices. Year 1. 1875. Thomas. The leather chairs at White's were deep and comfortable. The brandy was excellent, and Lord Blackwood was in an expansive mood. Around them, gentlemen conducted business in hushed tones, the air thick with cigar smoke and the quiet rustle of newspapers. "To our partnership," Blackwood said, raising his glass. "The railway expansion will make us both very wealthy men, Hargrave." Thomas touched his glass to Blackwood's, managing what he hoped was an appropriate smile. "I'm honored by your confidence. Well deserved, I assure you." Blackwood leaned back, studying Thomas over the rim of his glass. "I hear you dismissed some of your household staff recently. Spring cleaning?" Thomas's hand tightened on his glass. "Simply streamlining the household. More efficient this way." "Quite right. Can't be too careful about who one keeps in employment." Blackwood's tone was casual, but his eyes were sharp. "One bad apple and all that. Reputation is everything in our line of work." "Indeed." Thomas took a long drink, forcing himself to maintain eye contact. The conversation moved on to safer topics: investments, politics, the upcoming season. Thomas participated mechanically, saying the right things at the right moments, but his mind was elsewhere. When he finally returned home that evening, the townhouse felt cavernous. His footsteps echoed in the hallway as he made his way to his study, past the servants' quarters where Emily had once lived. He paused outside the door, the one that had been hers. Mrs. Pemberton had been dismissed shortly after Emily left. She'd made her disapproval too clear to ignore. The new housekeeper, Mrs. Thornton, was older, efficient, and mercifully incurious. She occupied these rooms now, and everything was proper, orderly, exactly as it should be. So why did the house feel like a tomb? Thomas continued to his study, poured himself another brandy, and tried not to think about where Emily might be. He'd made inquiries, discreet ones, shortly after she'd left. His man of business had reported that she'd taken a room in the East End, but Thomas had stopped him before he could say more. What would be the point of knowing? The thing was done. His reputation was intact, his business prospects excellent. He'd made the only sensible choice. He repeated this to himself like a prayer, but the hollow feeling in his chest remained. Emily. The pain was worse than anything Emily had imagined. "That's it, girl. Breathe through it," Mrs. Dawson urged, pressing a cool cloth to Emily's forehead. "You're doing well." Emily wanted to laugh at that or scream. She was lying on a narrow bed in a cramped room, biting down on a leather strap to keep from crying out and disturbing the other tenants. This wasn't well. This was survival at its most brutal. "I can see the head," Mrs. Dawson said. "One more push, Emily. One more." Emily bore down with the last of her strength, and suddenly the pressure released. A moment of terrifying silence, then a cry, thin and reedy, but unmistakably alive. "A boy," Mrs. Dawson announced, her voice thick with emotion. "You have a son." She placed the baby on Emily's chest, still attached by the cord, and Emily looked down at him through tears. He was red-faced and angry, his tiny fists waving, and when he opened his eyes, green. Unmistakably, devastatingly green. Thomas's eyes stared up at her from her son's face. Emily's heart broke and mended in the same instant. This child was both a reminder of everything she'd lost and a promise of everything she'd gained. He was hers. Completely, utterly hers. "Hello," she whispered, touching his impossibly small hand, his fingers wrapped around hers with surprising strength. "Hello, James." She'd chosen the name weeks ago. James, steady, solid, nothing like the aristocratic Thomas. Her son would be James Shaw, and he would grow up knowing he was wanted. "Your father was a good man," Emily told him, the lie coming easily now that she'd practiced it so many times in her mind. "He died before you were born, but he loved us. He had green eyes, just like yours. You have his eyes." James made a small sound, nuzzling against her, and Emily held him closer. Let him have Thomas's eyes. Let him have that much. But everything else, his character, his values, his heart, those would be hers to shape. Mrs. Dawson moved quietly around the room, cleaning up, giving them this moment. When she finally spoke, her voice was gentle. "You'll be a good mother, Emily Shaw. That boy is lucky to have you." Emily pressed her lips to James's forehead, breathing in his impossibly sweet scent. "I'll make sure he knows he's loved. That will be enough." Year 3, 1877. Thomas. Lady Helena Ashworth was everything a gentleman could want in a wife. Beautiful, accomplished, well-connected, with a dowry substantial enough to be respectable, but not so large as to be vulgar. She played the pianoforte beautifully, spoke French fluently, and had exactly the right opinions on every social matter. Thomas had been courting her for 3 months, and everyone agreed they were an ideal match. The garden party at the Ashworth estate was the perfect setting for a proposal. The weather was fine, the roses were in bloom, and Lady Helena had maneuvered him away from the main gathering with a skill that suggested she knew what was coming. "It's lovely here, don't you think?" she said, her hand light on his arm. "So peaceful." "Very lovely," Thomas agreed automatically. They walked in silence for a moment, following a path that led to a secluded bench overlooking the garden. This was the moment. Thomas reached into his pocket, feeling the small box he'd placed there that morning. Then he saw them. At the far end of the garden, near the servants' entrance, a woman stood with a small boy, perhaps 3 years old. She was adjusting his cap, laughing at something he'd said. The boy reached up to touch her face, and she caught his hand and kissed it. The tenderness of the gesture struck Thomas like a physical blow. His child would be 3 years old now. Perhaps a girl with Emily's soft brown eyes, or a boy with Lord Hargrave? Thomas realized he'd stopped walking. Lady Helena was looking at him with concern, and his hand had gone slack on her arm. "Are you quite well? You've gone pale." Thomas's throat felt tight. "Forgive me. I'm not feeling well. Perhaps something I ate." The concern in Lady Helena's eyes shifted to something else, disappointment, perhaps, or suspicion. She was no fool. She'd certainly noticed that while he'd been an attentive suitor, he'd never been an ardent one. "Of course," she said, her tone cooling slightly. "Shall I call for your carriage? I think it best if I return to London. I have some business matters that require attention." It was a transparent excuse, and they both knew it. But Lady Helena was too well-bred to call him on it. She simply inclined her head and allowed him to escort her back to the house. Thomas left within the hour. By the time he reached his country estate, the sun was setting, and he was alone with his thoughts, a state he'd been avoiding for 3 years. That night, he learned that Lady Helena had accepted an offer from Lord Pemberton. The news came with knowing looks and whispered speculation about the peculiar Lord Hargrave, who seemed strangely reluctant to settle down. Let them whisper. What did it matter? Emily. Mr. Davies was a kind man. That was the first thing Emily had noticed about him when she'd started buying her provisions from his shop 2 years ago. He always added a little extra to her order, an extra apple for James, a bit more cheese than she'd paid for. Small kindnesses that made a difference when every penny counted. He'd started asking her to walk with him on Sunday afternoons 6 months ago. Nothing improper, always in public, always respectful. He'd met James and treated the boy with genuine warmth, teaching him to identify different types of produce, slipping him treats when he thought Emily wasn't looking. "He's a bright lad," Mr. Davies had said more than once. "Credit to you." Now, on a mild spring evening, they stood outside his shop after closing, and Mr. Davies was clearing his throat nervously. "Miss Shaw, Emily, I hope you won't think me presumptuous, but I've grown very fond of you, and of young James. I know your circumstances aren't easy, and I would be honored if you would consider becoming my wife." Emily had known this was coming. She'd seen it in the way he looked at her, the increasing frequency of his small kindnesses. Part of her had been preparing for this moment, weighing the practical benefits. Security for James, a father figure, respectability, a real home instead of cramped rooms above a laundry. These were not small things. But as she looked at Mr. Davies's hopeful face, Emily realized something. She didn't love him. More importantly, she didn't need him. 6 years ago, she'd been a frightened girl dependent on a man's whims. Now she was a skilled seamstress with a growing list of clients. She'd built something on her own, small, yes, precarious, certainly, but hers. Independence she'd earned through countless late nights and calloused fingers. "Mr. Davies," she said gently, "you do me great honor. You're a good man, and you've been kind to James and me. But I can't accept." His face fell. Is it because of James's father? Because I don't care about—" "No," Emily interrupted. "It's not about him. It's about me. I've built a life for myself and my son. It's not much, but it's ours, and I'm not ready to give that up." Mr. Davies nodded slowly, disappointment clear in his eyes, but acceptance too. "I understand. If you ever change your mind. You're a good man, Mr. Davies. You deserve someone who can love you the way you deserve." That evening, Mrs. Dawson found Emily in her usual corner, sewing by lamplight while James slept nearby. "Heard Mr. Davies proposed," Mrs. Dawson said without preamble. "Heard you turned him down. News travels fast. In this neighborhood, always." Mrs. Dawson settled into her chair with a grunt. "Still carrying a torch for him? The father?" Emily's hands stilled on her work. She thought about it honestly. Did she still love Thomas? The sharp pain of his betrayal had dulled to a distant ache. She rarely thought of him anymore, except when she looked at James's green eyes. "No," she said finally. "I'm carrying a torch for myself, for what I've built. I won't trade my independence for security, no matter how attractive the offer." Mrs. Dawson smiled, rare and approving. "Good girl. You've got more spine than most." Emily glanced at James, sleeping peacefully, one small hand curled under his chin. "I have to, for him." Year 6, 1880. Thomas. The christening was interminable. Thomas stood in the church, holding his friend Westbrook's newborn son, and felt as though he were drowning. The baby, barely a month old, was so impossibly small, so fragile. His tiny hand wrapped around Thomas's finger with surprising strength, and Thomas felt something crack open inside his chest. His child would be 6 years old now. 6 years. Old enough to talk, to run, to ask questions about the world. Old enough to have a personality, preferences, fears, and dreams. Old enough to be a person, not just an abstract concept Thomas had spent 6 years trying not to think about. "Isn't he wonderful?" Westbrook's wife asked, beaming with new mother pride. "Yes," Thomas managed. "Wonderful." He handed the baby back as soon as he could politely do so and made his excuses, leaving the celebration early. That night, alone in his study, always alone, Thomas drank more than he should have and allowed himself to think the thoughts he'd forbidden for 6 years. Boy or girl? Emily had been 3 months along when he'd sent her away. His child would have been born in, he calculated, late spring or early summer of 1875. 5 years, 5 months old. No, 6 years, almost 6.5 years now. He could find out. He had the resources. One word to his man of business, and he could know everything where Emily lived. Whether she'd survived the birth, whether the child had lived, whether it was a son or daughter. His hand hovered over the bell pull that would summon a servant. Then he stopped. What right did he have to know? He'd made his choice 6 years ago. He'd chosen his reputation, his business interests, his comfortable life. He'd chosen to turn his back on Emily and their unborn child. The railway investment had made him wealthy. His partnership with Blackwood had opened doors to even more lucrative opportunities. He was successful, respected, invited to the best houses, and he was utterly, devastatingly alone. Thomas poured himself another brandy and stared into the fire. Somewhere in London, his child was growing up without knowing him. Perhaps that was for the best. What kind of father would he have been anyway? What kind of father chooses comfort over responsibility? The hollow feeling that had taken up residence in his chest 6 years ago had grown into a chasm. "Emily." "Ma'am, look. I drew a horse." Emily looked up from her sewing to find James holding up a scrap of paper covered in smudged charcoal drawings. The horses were crude but enthusiastic, all spindly legs and flowing manes. "It's beautiful, love," she said, and meant it. At 6 years old, James was endlessly curious about everything, but horses had captured his imagination completely. He drew them constantly, talked about them incessantly, and stopped to stare at every horse and carriage that passed. "When I'm big, I'm going to have a real horse," James announced, settling beside her with his drawings. "A big black one, like the one that pulled the fine carriage yesterday." "That's a wonderful dream," Emily said, smoothing his unruly brown hair. She'd been teaching him to read using old newspapers Mrs. Dawson collected. James had taken to it immediately, his quick mind soaking up words and sounds with ease that delighted Emily and occasionally unnerved her. He was so bright, so hungry for knowledge. What opportunities might he have had if— No, she wouldn't think about that. James's circumstances were what they were, and she would make the best of them. "Ma'am?" James looked up at her with those devastatingly green eyes. "Why don't I have a papa like the other boys?" The question came periodically, more frequently as James grew older and more aware of what he was missing. Emily had her answer prepared, practiced until it came smoothly. "Your papa loved us very much," she said, pulling James onto her lap. "But he's watching over us from heaven. He died before you were born." "What was he like?" He was. He was handsome and clever. He had green eyes, just like yours, and he would have been so proud of you. James considered this, then seemed to accept it as he always did. But Emily noticed the way he watched other fathers and sons in the street, the longing in his eyes, the questions he didn't ask. That night, after James had fallen asleep, Emily sat by the window of their small room, looking out at the sleeping city. Somewhere out there, Thomas Hargrave was living his comfortable life, probably never thinking about the son he'd abandoned. Did he ever wonder? Did he ever lie awake at night and calculate how old his child would be? Did he feel even a fraction of the regret he should feel? Emily told herself she didn't care. She'd built a good life for herself and James without him. They had a roof over their heads, food on the table, and each other. That was enough. But sometimes, in the quiet hours before dawn, she wondered what might have been if Thomas had made a different choice. Miles away, in a townhouse in Mayfair, Thomas Hargrave lay awake in his empty bed, staring at the ceiling and thinking about a child he'd never met. And in the East End, Emily Shaw held her sleeping son and wondered if the man who'd given him those green eyes ever thought about them at all. They were separated by miles and by choices made long ago, but bound together by the child sleeping peacefully, dreaming of horses and a father he'd never known. Chapter 4. Eyes Like Mirrors. The wheel had thrown itself spectacularly, sending the carriage lurching to one side with a crack that echoed down the narrow street. Thomas's driver had sworn quietly, but Thomas had heard it, and now they were stranded in a part of London Thomas rarely saw, and certainly never visited on foot. "How long to repair it?" Thomas asked, stepping down from the carriage. His driver examined the wheel with a grim expression. "An hour at least, my lord. Maybe 2. There's a wheelwright 3 streets over, but I'll need to fetch him." Thomas looked around at the unfamiliar landscape. They were near the docks, having just concluded a meeting about shipping investments. The business meeting had been in a respectable establishment, but the carriage had carried them deeper into the East End before the wheel gave way. "Go," Thomas said. "I'll wait here." "My lord, perhaps you should wait in the carriage." "I'll be fine. Go." The driver hurried off, leaving Thomas standing on a corner that felt like another world entirely. The street pulsed with life, raucous, chaotic, overwhelming. Street vendors called out their wares, in voices hoarse from constant use. Children darted between adults, playing games Thomas couldn't identify. The smell was overpowering. Unwashed bodies, rotting vegetables, horse manure, and beneath it all, the sharp tang of the river. Thomas felt profoundly disconnected from it all, as though he were watching through glass. This was London too, he knew intellectually, but it bore no resemblance to the London he inhabited. His London was clean streets and quiet parlours, measured words and proper manners. This London was raw survival. He was contemplating finding a tavern to wait in when the commotion started. "Thief! Stop him! Little rat stole from my father's shop." A boy burst through the crowd, clutching a loaf of bread to his chest. He was small, perhaps 6 or 7, with wild brown hair and ragged clothes that had been patched so many times they were more patch than original fabric. But he moved with the confidence of someone who knew these streets intimately, ducking and weaving through the crowd with practiced ease. Behind him, an older boy, perhaps 14, gave chase, red-faced and furious. Thomas watched with detached curiosity as the smaller boy dodged around a fruit cart, slipped between 2 arguing men, and made a sharp turn that would have lost his pursuer if not for... The collision happened so fast Thomas had no time to brace himself. The boy ran directly into his legs with enough force to bounce backward, landing hard on the cobblestones. The bread went flying. Time seemed to slow. The boy looked up, breathing hard, clearly preparing to apologize or perhaps to run again, and Thomas looked down. Green eyes met green eyes. Thomas felt the world tilt. Those eyes, his eyes, the Hargrave green that had been passed down through 5 generations, stared up at him from a face smudged with dirt and too thin by half, but the eyes were unmistakable. Impossible to deny. "Sorry, sir. I didn't mean..." the boy started, scrambling to his feet. Then the older boy caught up, grabbing the smaller one by the collar. "Got you, you little thief." Thomas stood frozen, unable to speak, unable to think beyond the thundering realization. "This is my son. I wasn't stealing." The boy twisted in his captor's grip with impressive determination. "I was buying it. I have money. Look." He dug into his pocket with his free hand and produced 3 pennies, holding them up for inspection. "See? 3 pence for the loaf. That's what your dar charges." I was going to pay, but you started chasing me before I could. The older boy hesitated, looking at the coins, then at Thomas, who was still staring in dumbstruck silence. Perhaps seeing a gentleman watching made him uncertain of his position. He still ran, the older boy said, but with less conviction. Because you were chasing me. The smaller boy wrenched himself free with a final twist and quickly scooped up the fallen bread, brushing it off. I didn't do nothing wrong. The older boy, clearly unsure what to do with a gentleman as witness, muttered something under his breath and stalked off. The smaller boy straightened his ragged jacket with an odd sort of dignity, a gesture so familiar it made Thomas's chest ache. He'd seen his father make that exact movement 100 times, adjusting his coat after a difficult conversation, reclaiming composure through ritual. Thank you for standing there, sir, the boy said, clutching his bread. Sometimes that's enough. People don't like causing trouble when there's a gentleman watching. Thomas opened his mouth, but no words came out. What could he possibly say? The boy tilted his head, studying Thomas with unsettling intensity. His gaze lingered on Thomas's face, and something shifted in his expression, curiosity perhaps, or recognition of some kind. You have green eyes like mine, the boy said suddenly. Ma'am says my papa had green eyes. She says I have his eyes exactly. The words hit Thomas like a physical blow. He tried to speak, tried to ask the boy's name, tried to say anything, but his throat had closed completely. The boy waited a moment, as though expecting a response. When none came, he shrugged with the easy acceptance of a child used to adults being strange. I have to get home before Ma'am worries, he said. Thank you again, sir. And then he was gone, darting into the crowd with the same practiced ease he'd shown before, disappearing into the churning mass of humanity as though he'd never been there at all. Thomas stood frozen in the middle of the street, staring at the space where the boy had vanished. Around him, life continued, vendors calling, children playing, the city moving in its endless rhythm. But Thomas couldn't move, couldn't breathe, couldn't think beyond the single, shattering realization. My son. That was my son. 6 years old, ragged and too thin, clutching 3 pennies and a loaf of bread like treasures, running through the streets, chased and accused, with no one to protect him, with Thomas's eyes in his face and Thomas's gesture in his movements, and absolutely no idea who Thomas was. Ma'am says my papa had green eyes. So Emily had told him, had given their son the truth in that small detail at least. Had she told him Thomas was dead? She must have. What else would she say? That his father had abandoned them both? That he'd valued reputation over their lives? My lord? Thomas turned to find his driver approaching with the wheelwright in tow. How long had he been standing here? Minutes? Hours? Time had lost all meaning. Are you quite well, my lord? You look unwell. Thomas's voice came out rough, unfamiliar. I'm fine. See to the wheel. But he wasn't fine. As they worked on the carriage, Thomas remained rooted to his spot, scanning the crowd desperately for another glimpse of brown hair and green eyes. The boy didn't reappear. The ride back to Mayfair passed in a blur. Thomas was dimly aware of the driver speaking to him, asking questions he didn't hear and couldn't answer. His mind was full of green eyes and 3 pennies, and a small, proud voice saying, I wasn't stealing. His son, alive and real, and running through the streets like any other slum child. His son, who thought his father was dead. His son, who'd stood there talking to him and hadn't known. By the time the carriage reached his townhouse, Thomas's hands were shaking. He climbed down mechanically, ignoring his driver's concerned questions, and walked inside on unsteady legs. In his study, he poured himself brandy with trembling hands and collapsed into his chair. The amber liquid sloshed over the rim of the glass, but he didn't notice. For 6 years, Thomas had managed not to know. He'd kept his son abstract, theoretical, a choice he'd made that he didn't allow himself to examine too closely. He'd refused to find out if Emily had survived, if the child had lived, if it was a boy or a girl. He'd built walls around that part of his past and pretended it didn't exist. But now he knew. Now he'd seen. Green eyes in a thin face, his father's gesture in a child's movements, 3 pennies clutched like a fortune, the odd dignity of a boy who'd done nothing wrong defending himself to an accuser. You have green eyes like mine. Thomas set down his glass before he dropped it. His whole body was shaking now, trembling with the weight of what he'd seen, what he'd done, what he'd lost. Somewhere in the slums of London, his son was going home to Emily with a loaf of bread, and neither of them knew that Thomas had finally seen what he'd been running from for 6 years. The carefully constructed denial that had allowed Thomas to live with himself shattered completely, leaving him sitting alone in his comfortable study, surrounded by the trappings of success that suddenly meant nothing at all. My son, Thomas thought, and the hollowness in his chest became a chasm that threatened to swallow him whole. Chapter 5. Watching from the shadows. Thomas didn't sleep that night. He lay in his bed, staring at the ceiling, seeing green eyes every time he closed his own. When dawn finally broke, he abandoned any pretense of rest and dressed quickly, his hands still unsteady. He had to know. He had to see them again. By mid-morning, Thomas found himself back in the East End, standing on the corner where his carriage had broken down the day before. In the daylight, the streets looked different, less threatening perhaps, but no less foreign. He felt conspicuous in his fine coat and polished boots, but no one paid him much attention. Gentlemen occasionally ventured into these areas on business, after all. Thomas approached a street vendor selling roasted chestnuts, an older man who seemed to have a permanent station on the corner. "Excuse me," Thomas said, keeping his voice casual. "Yesterday there was a boy here, brown hair, about 6 years old. He ran into me. Do you know him?" The vendor squinted up at Thomas, assessing. "Might do. Why are you asking?" Thomas had prepared for this. "He dropped something. I'd like to return it." The lie came surprisingly easily. The vendor's expression softened slightly. "Sharp lad. That one. Lives with his mam above the laundry on Copper Street." He pointed down a narrow lane. "Emily Shaw. Good woman. Works herself to the bone for that boy. You'll find them there most days." Thomas's heart stopped at hearing her name spoken aloud. Emily Shaw. She'd kept her maiden name then. Or perhaps she'd taken a false married name to avoid scandal and then simply stopped using it. Either way, she was alive. They were both alive. "Thank you," Thomas managed, pressing a coin into the vendor's hand, far too much for the information, but he didn't care. "You're generous?" "Sir," the vendor said, pocketing the coin with a knowing look. "But if you're thinking what I think you're thinking, tread careful. Miss Shaw's had enough troubles without—" "I mean them no harm," Thomas interrupted. "I simply wish to return what was lost." Another lie. Or perhaps not. Perhaps he did want to return something, though what he'd taken couldn't be given back with mere words or money. Thomas found Copper Street easily enough. It was narrow and shabby, the buildings leaning toward each other as though for support. The laundry was on the ground floor of a particularly worn structure, steam visible through the windows even from the street. He stationed himself across the road, partially hidden in the doorway of an abandoned shop, and waited. He didn't have to wait long. Within an hour, Emily emerged. Thomas felt his breath catch. She looked older, of course she did. 6 years had passed, but the changes went deeper than mere age. She was thinner, her face showing the sharp edges of someone who'd known real hunger. Her dress was shabby but clean, carefully mended in multiple places. Her hair, once glossy chestnut, was pulled back severely, showing threads of premature grey. But she moved with purpose, with strength he didn't remember from before. This wasn't the uncertain young maid who'd stood in his study 6 years ago. This was a woman who'd survived. Thomas watched her walk down the street, a basket over her arm, and felt shame settle over him like a physical weight. Over the following days, Thomas returned again and again. He hired no investigator this time, couldn't bear to delegate this to someone else, couldn't stand the thought of anyone else knowing. He simply came each morning and watched, drawn by a compulsion he couldn't name or resist. He learned their rhythms. Emily left early for her work. She seemed to do sewing for several households now, not just laundry work. James would emerge later, usually with an older woman Thomas assumed was Mrs. Dawson. The boy would play in the street with other children, inventing elaborate games that seemed to involve a great deal of running and shouting. One afternoon, Thomas watched as James defended a smaller boy from a group of older children. The bullies had cornered the smaller child, clearly intent on taking whatever he had in his pockets. James had inserted himself between them, small and ragged but utterly fearless. "Leave him alone," James said, his voice carrying across the street. "He's half your size. Pick on someone who can fight back." "Like you?" one of the older boys sneered. "If that's what it takes." The older boys had laughed, but something in James's stance, or perhaps the small crowd of adults who'd stopped to watch, made them back down. They'd left with muttered threats, and James had helped the smaller boy up, checking him for injuries with a gentleness that made Thomas's throat tight. The boy had principles, courage, a sense of justice that no one had taught him, because Thomas certainly hadn't been there to do so. Another day, Thomas followed at a distance as Emily and James went to the market. He watched as Emily taught James arithmetic, using apples from a vendor's cart. "If we buy 3 apples at 2 pence each, how much will it cost us?" James's face scrunched in concentration. 2, 4, 6 pence. Exactly right. Emily's face transformed when she smiled at their son, all the hardness falling away, revealing the girl Thomas had known. "You're so clever, my love." "Can we afford 6 pence for apples, ma'am?" "Today we can. Mrs. Henderson paid me for the dress I finished, and she gave me a little extra." James beamed and carefully selected 3 apples, examining each one with the seriousness of someone making an important decision. Thomas watched them walk away together, Emily's hand on James's shoulder, the boy chattering about something that made Emily laugh. They were poor, desperately so, by the standards Thomas knew, but they weren't defeated. There was joy there, small and hard-won, but real. He'd denied them this. He could have given them comfort, security, a life where Emily didn't have to choose between apples and other necessities, where James didn't have to defend smaller children because no one else would, where neither of them had to struggle simply to survive. The guilt was crushing, but Thomas couldn't stop watching, couldn't stop trying to see who his son was, who Emily had become, what their lives looked like without him. The pivotal moment came on the 5th night. Thomas had been watching Emily's building at dusk, unable to make himself leave, when he noticed the ground floor window was open to catch the evening breeze. He moved closer, staying in the shadows, and could see directly into their small room. Emily was tucking James into bed, a narrow mattress in the corner, patched blankets pulled up to his chin. She sat beside him, a battered book in her hands, and began to read. Thomas couldn't make out the words, but he could see James's face rapt, engaged, occasionally interrupting with questions. After she'd finished reading, James said something Thomas couldn't quite hear, but he saw Emily's expression shift, saw pain flash across her face before she smoothed it away. Her voice, when she answered, was steady and clear enough to carry through the open window. "He would have been so proud of you." Thomas understood. James had asked about his father. Again. And Emily had lied kindly, protectively, to spare their son the truth. "He would have been so proud of you." Thomas backed away from the window, his vision blurring. He made it to a nearby alley before his legs gave out. He leaned against the wall, sliding down until he was sitting on the filthy ground, and for the first time in 6 years, he wept. Silent tears at first, then great shaking sobs that he muffled against his arms. He cried for the years he'd lost, for the son he didn't know, for Emily's strength and the lies she had to tell. He cried for his own cowardice, for the choice he'd made, and the price they'd paid. "He would have been so proud of you." But Thomas wasn't proud. He was ashamed, devastated, destroyed by the reality of what he'd thrown away. When he finally composed himself enough to stand, his fine coat was filthy and his face was wet. He stumbled home through the darkening streets, seeing nothing, knowing only that he couldn't continue like this, watching from the shadows, too much a coward to face what he'd done. Mrs. Dawson had noticed the gentleman on the 3rd day. She said nothing to Emily, not yet, but she watched him watching, saw the way he stared at their building, at Emily when she passed, at James when he played in the street. She noted his fine clothes, his obvious discomfort in the neighborhood, the desperate look in his eyes. She'd seen that look before, years ago, in different circumstances, but she recognized it. Guilt, longing, regret that came too late. Mrs. Dawson kept her suspicions to herself, but she stayed vigilant. If this man meant to cause trouble for Emily and James, he'd have to go through her first. And she'd protected Emily once before. She'd do it again if necessary. But something in the way the gentleman watched the raw pain in his face when he looked at them made her wonder if trouble was what he intended, or if he was simply a man finally confronting the consequences of his choices. She'd wait and watch, and if he approached Emily or James, she'd be ready. Chapter 6. The Reckoning. Mrs. Dawson waited until James had gone out to play before she spoke. "There's been a gentleman watching the house," she said without preamble, her hands continuing their work folding linens. "Well-dressed, fine coat, expensive boots. He's been here near every day for a week now. I'd wager he's watching for you." Emily's hands stilled on the shirt she was mending. Her heart began to pound, though whether from fear or something else, she couldn't say. "What does he look like?" Her voice came out steady, which surprised her. "Tall, dark hair, going grey at the temples, Green eyes. Mrs. Dawson looked up, her gaze sharp. Green eyes just like your boy's. Thomas. The name came out as barely a whisper. I thought as much. Mrs. Dawson set down her folding. Question is, what are you going to do about it? Emily's mind raced. Thomas had found them. After 6 years of silence, of building a life without him, of telling James stories about a father who died loving them, Thomas had found them, and he'd been watching like a coward, from the shadows, too afraid to face what he'd done. Something hardened in Emily's chest. She'd spent 6 years surviving, 6 years being strong for James, 6 years living with the consequences of Thomas's choice. She wouldn't wait passively for him to decide what happened next. Not anymore. I'm going to find him, Emily said, standing. I won't have him lurking about, watching us like some spectre. If he wants something, he can face me directly. Mrs. Dawson nodded approvingly. I'll watch James. You take as long as you need. Emily changed into her best dress, still shabby, still mended, but clean and presentable. She pinned her hair carefully and looked at herself in the small mirror. 6 years had changed her. She wasn't the frightened girl who'd stood in Thomas's study, begging him to reconsider. She was a woman now, hardened by necessity, strengthened by survival. She was ready. Emily found him the next evening, exactly where Mrs. Dawson said he'd be, across the street from their building, standing in the shadow of a doorway as though he had any right to be there. She didn't hesitate. She marched across the street, her footsteps sharp on the cobblestones, and stopped directly in front of him. I know you've been watching us, she said, her voice cutting through the evening air. What do you want? Thomas startled, clearly caught off guard. In the fading light, Emily could see he looked terrible, haggard, hollow-eyed, as though he hadn't slept properly in days. Good, let him suffer even a fraction of what she'd endured. Emily, he stopped, seemed to struggle for words. I saw him, our son. I saw him and you what? Emily's voice was sharp as glass. Suddenly remembered we existed? It's been 6 years, Thomas. 6 years. I know it has. And he reached toward her, then stopped himself. Can we speak somewhere? Privately? No. The word came out flat, final. You don't get to come into my home. You gave up that right 6 years ago, when you threw us out of yours. Thomas flinched as though she'd struck him. Then perhaps we could walk? Please, Emily, I need to speak with you. Emily wanted to refuse, wanted to turn her back on him the way he'd turned his back on her, but she thought of James, of his endless questions about his father, and knew this conversation had to happen eventually. Fine, she said. We'll walk along the Thames, but make it quick. I have work to finish tonight. They walked in tense silence through the darkening streets until they reached the embankment. The river stretched out before them, dark and sluggish, reflecting the last rays of sunset. Other people walked nearby, couples, workers heading home, but none close enough to overhear. Thomas spoke first, his voice hesitant and raw. When I saw him, when I looked into his eyes and saw... He stopped, swallowed hard. I can't stop thinking about him, about you, about what I did. What you did, Emily repeated, her voice cold. Let me tell you about what you did, Thomas, since you seem to need reminding. Do you know what the first winter was like? I was pregnant, alone, terrified. I had £3 to my name, your generous parting gift. I slept in a room with 4 other women, and I could hear rats in the walls at night. I was so cold I thought I might not survive until morning. Emily, I'm not finished. Her voice rose, 6 years of pain and anger finally finding release. I worked until my hands bled. I went hungry, so I could save money for when the baby came. I gave birth on a narrow bed with only one person to help me, biting down on leather so I wouldn't scream and disturb the other tenants. And every single day, every single moment of suffering, I thought about you in your comfortable townhouse, living your comfortable life, having chosen your reputation over us. I'm sorry. Thomas's voice broke. I know those words aren't enough. You're right. They're not. Emily turned to face him fully, and in the dim light, she saw tears on his face. She felt nothing. You want to know about your son. His name is James. He's 6 years old, and he's asked about you every single day of his life. Every day, Thomas. And every day, I've had to invent a story about a father who loved him but died before he was born. I made you a hero in his eyes, so he wouldn't have to know the truth that his father was a coward who couldn't stand the thought of scandal. I was a coward. Thomas's facade was crumbling now, tears flowing freely. I was terrified of scandal, of disappointing my family, of losing everything I thought mattered. But none of it, his voice caught. None of those reasons justify what I did to you. To him, to us. Emily felt something shift inside her chest. Not forgiveness, not yet, perhaps not ever, but something. Recognition, maybe, that this broken man in front of her was genuinely suffering, that his regret, at least, was real. "Why are you here, Thomas?" she asked, quieter now. "After 6 years, why now? What do you want?" Thomas met her eyes, and the raw pain in them was almost too much to bear. "I want to know him. I want to provide for you both. I want to try to be what I should have been 6 years ago, a father to my son. And," he hesitated, "and whatever you'll allow me to be to you." "It's too late for us," Emily said flatly. "Whatever we had died 6 years ago in your study. I know that. But James," Thomas's voice broke again. "Please, Emily, let me try to be his father. Let me try to make amends for what I've done." Emily studied him for a long moment. Part of her wanted to refuse, to protect James from the possibility of abandonment, to keep their small, hard-won life safe from Thomas's disruption. But another part, the part that saw the longing in James's eyes when he watched other fathers and sons, knew that James deserved this chance. "James deserves to know his father," she said slowly. "But I won't let you hurt him. If you come into his life, you stay in his life. No more running when things become difficult. No more choosing reputation over responsibility." "I understand," Thomas said quickly. "I swear to you, Emily." "Do you?" Emily interrupted, her voice hard. "Do you truly understand? Can you look me in the eye and promise me that? Because if you abandon him again, Thomas, it will destroy him. He's a child. He won't understand that it's not his fault, that it's about your weakness and not his worth. And if you do that to him," her voice shook with suppressed fury, "if you do that to him, I will never forgive you. Not ever." Thomas stepped closer, close enough that she could see the desperation in his eyes. "I promise you, Emily, on whatever honor I have left, on anything you hold sacred, I will not abandon him again. I swear it." Emily searched his face, looking for any sign of doubt, any hint of the man who'd turned them away 6 years ago. What she saw instead was genuine anguish, deep regret, and something that looked almost like determination. She'd become good at reading people in the past 6 years. Survival had taught her to recognize sincerity from manipulation, truth from convenient lies, and despite everything, despite her anger and her pain, she believed him. "All right," she said finally, and saw relief flood Thomas's face. "Come to Sunday dinner, 6 o'clock. Don't be late, and don't bring anything expensive that will make us uncomfortable in our own home." "Thank you," Thomas whispered. "Thank you, Emily. Don't thank me yet. I have to tell James the truth first, that his father didn't die, that he's been away, but wants to know him now." She turned to leave, then paused. "And Thomas, he's going to have questions, hard questions. You'll answer them honestly, or this ends before it begins. Do you understand?" "Yes, I understand." Emily began walking back toward Copper Street, but she'd only gone a few steps when she stopped once more. Without turning around, she said quietly, "You should know he has your eyes, your quick mind, and thankfully, none of your pride. He's brave and kind and clever. He's a good boy, Thomas, better than either of us." She didn't wait for a response. She walked away, leaving Thomas standing alone by the river, and didn't let herself cry until she was back in her own room with the door firmly closed. Mrs. Dawson found her there an hour later, sitting on her bed with her face in her hands. "James is with the neighbor's children," Mrs. Dawson said gently, sitting beside her. "Tell me what happened." Emily told her everything, the confrontation, the conversation, the agreement she'd made. When she finished, Mrs. Dawson was quiet for a long moment. "Are you sure about this?" she finally asked. "It's a risk, letting him back into your lives." "I know," Emily said, "but I can't keep telling James his father is dead when he's alive and wants to know him. James deserves that chance, even if it terrifies me." "And what about you? What do you deserve?" Emily thought about that. What did she deserve? Certainly not the years of struggle she'd endured, but perhaps not revenge either. Perhaps just closure, understanding, a chance for James to know his father without the shadow of lies between them. "I deserve to see him try," Emily said finally, "to see if he means what he says. And if he fails," she lifted her chin, "then at least James will know I tried to give him a father, and Thomas will know exactly what he's thrown away. Again, Mrs. Dawson squeezed her hand. You're stronger than I was, Emily Shaw. My daughter never got the chance to confront her child's father. You've given him the truth, and now we'll see what he does with it. Emily nodded, but inside, she was trembling. Sunday was 3 days away. 3 days to figure out how to tell James that everything she'd told him about his father was a lie. 3 days to prepare for Thomas Hargrave to enter their small, carefully built world. 3 days to hope she wasn't making the biggest mistake of her life. Chapter 7. Fragile Beginnings and Old Threats. Emily waited until the afternoon to tell James. She'd rehearsed the words 100 times, but now, facing her son's trusting green eyes, they all felt inadequate. James, love, come sit with me. I need to tell you something important. James abandoned his drawing's horses again, always horses, and climbed onto the bed beside her. What is it, ma'am? Emily took a deep breath. You know how I've told you that your papa died before you were born? James nodded solemnly. Well, that wasn't entirely true. I told you that because, her voice caught, because it was easier than the real truth. Your papa didn't die, James. He's alive, and he wants to meet you. James's face went through a series of expressions, confusion, understanding, then something darker, anger. He's alive? James's voice was small, but there was hurt underneath. Why didn't he come before? Didn't he want me? Emily felt her heart crack. It's complicated, love. That's not an answer. James stood up, his small hands balled into fists. You said he loved us. You said he would have been proud of me. Were those lies too? James, I don't want to meet him. James's voice broke. If he didn't want to come before, I don't want him now. But even as he said it, Emily could see the war in his eyes, the hurt battling with desperate hope, the anger fighting with longing. He did want to meet his father. He just didn't want to be hurt again. He's coming to dinner tonight, Emily said quietly. At 6 o'clock. You don't have to talk to him if you don't want to. But I think you should give him a chance. James didn't answer. He went back to his drawings, but Emily noticed he didn't draw horses anymore. He drew nothing at all. Thomas arrived precisely at 6, clutching a package wrapped in brown paper. Emily opened the door before he could knock, her face carefully neutral. He knows, she said quietly. He's not happy about it. Thomas nodded, his own face pale. I understand. James sat at the small table, staring at his empty plate with fierce concentration. He didn't look up when Thomas entered. Hello, James, Thomas said softly. Silence. Thomas set the package on the table. I brought you something. I made it myself. Despite his determination not to care, James's eyes flickered to the package. Slowly, as though against his will, he reached out and unwrapped it. Inside was a wooden horse, beautifully carved, with a flowing mane and delicate features. It was clearly made with skill and care, hours of work evident in every detail. James stared at it, his hands trembling slightly. Emily could see the battle on his face. He wanted it so badly, but accepting it felt like betraying his anger. You can keep it even if you hate me, Thomas said quietly. It's yours regardless. James picked up the horse, running his fingers over the smooth wood. It's nice, he whispered finally. Then, looking up at Thomas for the first time, where have you been? The bluntness of the question made Emily wince, but Thomas met James's eyes steadily. I made a terrible mistake, he said. When your mother told me about you, I was scared. I thought about what people would say, about scandal, about my reputation, and I chose those things over you and your mother. I sent you away, and I've regretted it every day since. Why didn't you come sooner then? Because I was a coward. I told myself it was better for you if I stayed away, but really, I was just afraid to face what I'd done. Are you rich? James asked, his tone accusatory. Yes. So we could have had food and warm clothes and a nice house, but you didn't want us to. Thomas flinched. Yes, that's exactly right. The honesty seemed to surprise James. He'd clearly expected excuses, justifications. The stark admission of guilt disarmed him slightly. I love horses, James said abruptly, changing the subject. I noticed your drawings, Thomas said, gesturing to the papers scattered nearby. They're very good. Have you seen real horses? Not just cart horses, but proper ones. I have. I keep several at my estate. Would you? Thomas hesitated. Would you like to see them sometime? James's eyes lit up despite himself. Really? Really. Whenever you'd like. The dinner that followed was stilted, awkward, but not hostile. James asked more questions, some innocent, some designed to wound. Thomas answered all of them honestly, never making excuses, never trying to minimize his failures. By the end of the evening, James hadn't forgiven Thomas, but he'd accepted the horse, and when Thomas said goodbye, James offered a tentative, "See you tomorrow?" that made Thomas's eyes suspiciously bright. "If that's all right with your mother," Thomas said, looking at Emily. Emily nodded once, and Thomas left with something that looked almost like hope on his face. Over the following weeks, Thomas became a fixture in their lives. He came every day after his business concluded, bringing small gifts, books, art supplies, sweets that James shared with the neighborhood children. He took James to see the horses, and Emily came along, watching as Thomas lifted James onto a gentle mare. The boys' delighted laughter filled something inside Emily she hadn't realized was empty. In the evenings, Thomas would read to James adventure stories that had the boy hanging on every word. Emily would sew in the corner, listening, watching her son slowly open up to his father. It wasn't perfect. James still had moments of anger, still asked pointed questions about why Thomas had stayed away so long. But slowly, tentatively, he was warming. One evening, after James had fallen asleep, Thomas lingered by the door. "Thank you," he said quietly to Emily, "for letting me know him. He's remarkable." "He is," Emily agreed. Then softer, "And he's mine, Thomas, remember that." "I know. I'm not trying to take him from you. I just want to be part of his life." Emily studied Thomas in the lamplight. He looked different than he had 6 years ago, older, yes, but also humbler, less certain of his place in the world, perhaps even better for it. "Don't make me regret this," she said. "I won't, I promise." Emily wanted to believe him. Watching James with Thomas, seeing her son's face light up when his father arrived, made her want to believe. But a small, cautious part of her remained vigilant, waiting for the other shoe to drop. It dropped 3 days later. Thomas arrived at the gentlemen's club for what he'd thought was a routine meeting, only to find Lord Blackwood waiting with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Hargrave, good of you to come." "Blackwood." Thomas took the offered seat, unease prickling at the back of his neck. "I've been hearing interesting rumors," Blackwood said, swirling his brandy. "About a street urchin. About visits to the slums. My business partners and I have invested significantly based on your reputation, Hargrave. Imagine my concern when I hear such whispers." Thomas's blood ran cold. "I don't know what you're referring to." "Don't insult my intelligence." Blackwood's voice hardened. "I have investigators. The boy is 6 years old, interesting timing that. And the mother, Emily Shaw, formerly Emily Shaw, your maid, dismissed rather suddenly 6 years ago." Thomas said nothing. What could he say? "Here's what's going to happen," Blackwood continued. "There's a new railway expansion opportunity in Manchester, highly lucrative. You're going to withdraw your interest in it, let me take the lead position, and this unfortunate situation remains private. Or," he paused for effect, "or I ensure every drawing room in London knows about your bastard son." Thomas felt the familiar fear grip him, the same fear that had made him turn Emily away 6 years ago. Scandal, ruin, social death. "I need time to think," he managed. "You have 24 hours. Choose wisely, Hargrave." Thomas left the club in a daze, Blackwood's words echoing in his head. By the time he reached home, his old instincts had taken over. Protect yourself. Protect your position. Minimize the damage. He spent the night calculating. He could give Emily a substantial sum, enough to buy a house in Cornwall, or even book passage to America. James could attend a good school, have a comfortable life, be free from the stigma of illegitimacy, and Thomas could maintain his place in society. It was generous, really. Practical. The best solution for everyone. He repeated this to himself until he almost believed it. The next afternoon, Thomas arrived at Emily's with his proposal carefully prepared. "I've been thinking," he began, "about James's future, about what's best for him." Emily looked up from her sewing, immediately wary. "What do you mean?" "I've secured a sum of money, substantial, enough for you to buy a house in the countryside, Cornwall perhaps, or even passage to America. James could attend a good school, have opportunities he'll never have here." Emily's hands stilled. Her face went very pale, then flushed with color. "What brought this on?" "I want to provide for you both." "What brought this on?" Each word was sharp as a knife. Thomas hesitated, and that hesitation told Emily everything she needed to know. "Someone found out," she said flatly. "Someone knows about us, and you're trying to make us disappear again. It's not like that. It's exactly like that. Emily stood, her voice rising. So, when it becomes difficult, you banish us again. When it threatens your precious reputation, we're disposable again. I'm trying to protect you both. From what? From scandal? From embarrassment? No, Thomas. Her voice shook with fury. You're trying to protect yourself. From the next room, James had gone very still, listening to every word. Emily, please, if you'd just listen. Get out. Her voice was deadly quiet now, which was somehow worse than the shouting. I was a fool to trust you. You haven't changed at all. Emily, you made me a promise. Now she was shouting, tears streaming down her face. You looked me in the eye and swore you wouldn't abandon him, and at the first sign of trouble, here you are. Trying to send us away with money like that makes it acceptable. She moved toward him, and Thomas backed toward the door. Get out of my home. Get out and don't come back. Please, just let me explain. Emily physically pushed him, her hands against his chest, toward the door. Get out. Get out. Get out. Thomas stumbled into the hallway. The door slammed behind him, and he heard Emily's sobs through the thin wood, followed by Mrs. Dawson's voice, comforting. In the room, James sat frozen, clutching the wooden horse Thomas had made him. He'd heard everything, every word. He understood now. His father was ashamed of him. When it mattered, Thomas had chosen his reputation again. That night, James crawled into bed with Emily, something he hadn't done since he was very small. I don't need a papa, ma'am, he whispered. We're fine, just us. We've always been fine. Emily held him tightly, her heart shattering. I'm so sorry, love. I'm so sorry. Miles away, Thomas stood in his study, staring at himself in the mirror, the same mirror where he'd stood 6 years ago after sending Emily away. The same coward looked back at him. He poured himself brandy but found he couldn't drink it. He set the glass down and sank into his chair, head in his hands. What kind of man was he? At the first test, he'd failed again. He'd promised Emily he wouldn't abandon James, and he'd lasted barely 3 weeks before trying to send them away. He thought of James's bright laugh, the way he'd said "Papa" so tentatively, the trust that had been slowly building. Gone now, destroyed by Thomas's cowardice. He thought of Emily's strength, her willingness to give him a chance despite everything he'd done to her, and he'd betrayed that trust again. And he thought of Blackwood, of society, of reputation, the things he'd chosen over his family. Twice, the choice crystallized in Thomas's mind with sudden, painful clarity. He could have his comfortable life, his business partnerships, his place in society, or he could have his soul. He could not have both. For 6 years, he'd chosen comfort, and it had cost him everything that mattered. The question was, would he make the same choice again? Thomas sat in the darkness of his study, and for the first time in his life, truly understood what it meant to be at a crossroads. One path led back to safety, respectability, and the hollow emptiness he'd lived with for 6 years. The other led somewhere terrifying and uncertain but real. He had until tomorrow to decide who he wanted to be. Chapter 8. The Public Reckoning. The Ball. The Bellingham Ball was the pinnacle of the social season, a glittering affair where London's elite gathered to see and be seen, to conduct business in silk-lined corners, to secure advantageous marriages and profitable partnerships. The ballroom blazed with 1,000 candles, crystal chandeliers casting prismatic light across jewels and polished floors. Thomas Hargrave arrived late, dressed impeccably in black evening wear, but something about him was different. His eyes, usually guarded and distant, were clear, determined. He moved through the crowd with the air of a man who had made a decision and would not be swayed from it. Lord Blackwood spotted him immediately and approached with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. Hargrave, glad you've come to your senses. I've begun the Manchester paperwork with your withdrawal. Smooth transition, minimal fuss. Well done for being reasonable about this unfortunate business. Thomas met Blackwood's gaze steadily. You've misunderstood, Blackwood. I'm not withdrawing. The smile vanished from Blackwood's face. I beg your pardon? I said I'm not withdrawing from the Manchester investment, nor from any of our other partnerships, for that matter. Blackwood's expression hardened. Then you understand the consequences? You understand what I'll be forced to do? I do. Thomas's voice was calm, almost serene. In fact, I'm counting on it. Before Blackwood could respond, Thomas moved away, leaving the older man staring after him with dawning fury. In the servants' corridor below stairs, Emily was arranging refreshments on silver trays. Mrs. Dawson worked beside her, having brought Emily along for the evening work. The Bellinghams paid well, and Emily needed every shilling she could earn, especially after the rupture with Thomas. "You didn't have to come tonight," Mrs. Dawson said quietly. "I know it's difficult, being here among all this." Emily shook her head. "The money's good, and I won't let pride starve my son." She'd been working in mechanical silence, trying not to think about the opulent world just above her head, the world Thomas inhabited, the world she'd briefly thought might have room for her and James. She'd been a fool. Then she heard the commotion from the ballroom. Raised voices, a sudden hush in the conversations. "What's happening?" one of the other servants asked, craning to see. Emily found herself moving toward the servants' entrance to the ballroom, drawn by something she couldn't name. Through the doorway, she could see the glittering crowd, and in the center, Thomas and Lord Blackwood, taking the floor with false solemnity. "Friends," Blackwood announced, his voice carrying through the suddenly silent ballroom, "I must raise a matter of moral importance. We trust those in our circles to uphold certain standards. When someone fails those standards, when someone proves himself unworthy of the confidence we've placed in him—" "Lord Blackwood is quite right," Thomas interrupted, stepping forward. "And I have failed those standards." The ballroom erupted in whispers. Emily's hand flew to her mouth. What was he doing? Thomas's voice cut through the murmurs, clear and steady. 6 years ago, I committed an act of profound cowardice. A young woman who trusted me, who worked in my household, told me she was carrying my child. And I turned her away. The whispers grew louder. Emily felt tears streaming down her face, but she couldn't look away. I gave her a pittance, £3, and banished her to the streets, because I was more concerned with reputation than with basic human decency. I chose my comfort over her survival. I chose my social position over my own child. The crowd was shocked into silence now, every eye fixed on Thomas. "My son's name is James," Thomas continued, his voice growing stronger. "He is 6 years old, bright, kind, and brave, everything I was not. His mother is Miss Emily Shaw, a woman of far greater character than I have ever possessed. She has raised our son in poverty while I lived in comfort. She has worked herself to exhaustion while I attended balls like this one. She has been both mother and father to a child I abandoned." Emily was sobbing now, her hand pressed to her mouth to muffle the sound. Mrs. Dawson had moved beside her, a steadying hand on her shoulder. "I do not seek your forgiveness or understanding," Thomas said, addressing the room at large. "I seek only to acknowledge them publicly and to make amends for the suffering I have caused. James is my heir. He will inherit my estate, my titles, and my name if he chooses to accept them. As for your business ventures, Lord Blackwood," he turned to face the older man directly, "I withdraw from all partnerships with you, not because you forced me to, but because I choose my son over profit. I choose my family over business." He turned back to the crowd, and Emily could see the emotion in his face, raw, unguarded, real. "Many of you are parents. You understand the love one feels for a child. I denied myself that love for 6 years out of pride and fear. I won't deny it any longer, regardless of the cost." The ballroom had erupted into chaos, shocked conversations, scandalized gasps, a few scattered murmurs that might have been approval. Blackwood's face was purple with rage. "You're a fool, Hargrave. You've destroyed yourself for a bastard and a—" "Finish that sentence," Thomas said, his voice dropping to something cold and dangerous, "and I will call you out. That woman is worth 100 of you, and that boy is my son. My son." The crowd didn't know how to react. Some faces showed disgust, others showed grudging respect. Most showed pure shock. The scandal would be talked about for years. Thomas walked through the crowd, which parted before him like water. He moved through the entrance hall, and then he stopped, turned. His eyes found the servants' corridor, where Emily stood frozen. For a long moment, they simply looked at each other across the distance that separated their worlds. Thomas crossed to her, heedless of the watching eyes. "I don't expect you to forgive me," he said quietly, "but I needed you to know I chose you, both of you, finally." Then he was gone, walking out into the night, leaving his old life behind. Emily stood trembling in the doorway, tears streaming down her face, unable to process what had just happened. Mrs. Dawson squeezed her shoulder. "Come on, girl. Let's get you home." The aftermath. The next morning, Thomas's world had fundamentally changed. His breakfast table was covered with letters, nearly all of them unpleasant. Business partners writing to sever their arrangements. friends politely distancing themselves, his club informing him that his membership was under review, pending investigation into matters of moral character. He read them all with a strange sense of detachment. Each one was a bridge burning, a door closing, a piece of his old life falling away, and he felt lighter. His solicitor, Mr. Pemberton, arrived mid-morning, wringing his hands nervously. "My lord, the scandal is extensive. Every drawing-room in London is talking about last night. Your financial position remains stable, your investments are sound, your properties secure, but your social position," he trailed off delicately, "is ruined," Thomas finished calmly. "I understand. Some are calling you mad. Others are saying you were coerced, that there must be some explanation beyond. There is no other explanation. I did exactly what I said I did, and I'm not ashamed of it anymore." Thomas looked up at his solicitor. "Draw up the papers to establish a trust for James. A substantial one, include provisions for his education, his future, and for Emily's security. I want them both provided for, regardless of what happens to me." Mr. Pemberton made notes, his expression carefully neutral. "Very good, my lord. And, forgive me for asking, but do you intend to marry Miss Shaw?" "I intend to ask her," Thomas said quietly, "but I don't expect her to accept. Not now, perhaps not ever. She has every right to refuse me." Over the next 2 days, Thomas experienced his social exile firsthand. Former friends crossed the street to avoid him. Invitations dried up completely. Lady Ashworth, now Lady Pemberton, gave him a look of such contempt when their paths crossed that he felt it like a physical slap. But there were surprises too. Lord Westbrook, his friend who'd had the christening, stopped him on the street. "Hargrave, I heard about the ball." Thomas braced himself for condemnation. "That took courage," Westbrook said quietly. "More than I think I'd have, in your position. The boy's lucky to have you fighting for him now." It was the first kind word Thomas had received in 2 days, and it nearly undid him. Thomas didn't go to Emily immediately. He knew she needed time to process what had happened, to decide what it meant, if anything. He'd made his grand gesture, but he understood now that grand gestures weren't enough. It was the daily choice to show up, to be present, to choose family over comfort. That was what mattered. So he waited, working with his solicitor to secure James's future, and tried not to hope too much. On the 3rd day, Emily came to him. Mrs. Pemberton showed her into the study with a nod of approval. The housekeeper had heard what Thomas had done at the ball, and her opinion of him had shifted considerably. Thomas rose when Emily entered, his heart pounding. She looked tired, her face drawn, but there was something different in her eyes. Not forgiveness, exactly, but perhaps consideration. "Mrs. Dawson says I'm a fool if I don't at least hear you out," Emily said without preamble. She said men rarely change, but when they do, it's foolish to punish them for becoming better. "I don't deserve," Thomas began. "No, you don't," Emily interrupted. "But perhaps that's not the point anymore. I've spent 6 years being angry, Thomas. 6 years carrying that hurt, that betrayal, and I'm tired. I'm so tired." She sat in the chair across from his desk, the same chair she'd sat in 6 years ago when she'd told him about the pregnancy. But everything was different now. They were different. "What you did at the ball," Emily's voice was soft. "You know you've destroyed your reputation." "My reputation was built on a lie," Thomas said simply. "Let it burn. People are talking, saying terrible things about you, about us. Let them talk." Emily studied him for a long moment. "James heard us arguing. The night you came with that proposal to send us away. He heard everything. He thinks you're ashamed of him." Thomas felt as though he'd been struck. "Then I need to tell him the truth. May I? Please. You understand this isn't about grand gestures anymore." Emily's voice was intense now. "It's not about public declarations or trust funds or any of that. It's about showing up, day after day, being present even when it's difficult, even when it's boring, even when there's no one watching to applaud you for it." "I understand," Thomas said. "I can't undo the past, Emily. I can't give you back those 6 years, can't erase the suffering I caused. But I can choose differently now. I can be the man I should have been from the beginning. Let me try, please." Emily was quiet for so long that Thomas thought she might refuse. Then, slowly, she nodded. "I won't marry you," she said. "Not now, perhaps not ever. I've built a life on my own terms, and I won't lose that. I won't become Mrs. Thomas Hargrave and disappear into your shadow. I'm not asking you to, Thomas said quickly. "I'm asking only for the chance to be James's father, and perhaps to earn your trust again, in time, however long it takes." Emily stood, and for a moment, Thomas thought she was leaving. Instead, she moved to the window, looking out at the street below. "Come to dinner tomorrow evening," she said finally. 6 o'clock. And Thomas, when you tell James you're not ashamed of him, mean it, because he'll know if you don't. Children always know. "I will. I do mean it." Emily nodded once and left, leaving Thomas alone with the first real hope he'd felt in days. New beginning. Thomas arrived at Emily's rooms precisely at 6 the next evening, his hands trembling slightly as he knocked. Emily opened the door. "He's in the other room. He knows you're coming, but he won't look at me, won't talk about it." Thomas stepped inside, and there was James, sitting in the corner with his arms wrapped around his knees, the wooden horse Thomas had carved, sitting forgotten nearby. Thomas crossed the room and knelt to James's level, making himself small, non-threatening. "I need to tell you something important," Thomas said gently. "You heard me and your mother arguing the other night. You heard me talking about sending you away." James didn't respond, but Thomas saw his shoulders tense. "You think I don't want people to know about you, that I'm ashamed of you, aren't you?" James's voice was small, broken. "You wanted to send us away where no one would see us." "I was afraid," Thomas admitted. "A bad man threatened to tell everyone about you, and for a moment, just a moment, I let that fear control me. I thought about making the same mistake I made 6 years ago, choosing my comfort over you. But then I realized something." He reached into his coat and pulled out a newspaper, spreading it on the floor between them. The headline was bold and unmistakable. "Lord Hargrave acknowledges illegitimate hire." "Look at this," Thomas said. "See what it says? I stood up in front of everyone who matters in London society, everyone I was so afraid of 6 years ago, and I told them about you. I told them your name. I told them you're my son and my heir. I told them because I'm proud of you, James. I'm proud you're my son." James picked up the newspaper with trembling hands, staring at the headline. You told everyone?" "Everyone. And they're angry with me now. They think I'm foolish. Some of them won't speak to me anymore. But I don't care, because nothing is worth losing you. Not money, not reputation, not anything." "But why did you want to send us away then?" James's voice was still uncertain, still hurt. Thomas took a deep breath. "Because I was scared. And when I'm afraid, I sometimes make terrible choices. I did it 6 years ago when your mother told me about you, and I almost did it again the other night. But I'm not going to do it anymore. I'm going to make a different choice now. I'm going to choose you. Every single day, I'm going to choose you." James looked up at him with those devastating green eyes, Thomas's own eyes looking back at him. "Promise?" "I promise. And this time, I'll keep my promise. I'll prove it to you, not with words but with actions. Every day, for as long as you'll let me." James was quiet for a long moment. Then, tentatively, "Can we still go see the horses?" Thomas felt his eyes sting with tears. "Whenever you want. Tomorrow, if you'd like." "Okay." James's voice was small, but it was something, a beginning. 6 weeks passed. Thomas had moved Emily and James to a comfortable house in a respectable neighborhood. Not grand, not his townhouse in Mayfair, but something that could be theirs. A place where James could have his own room, where Emily could work without the constant noise and smell of the slums, where they could build something new together. Emily had resisted at first, wary of accepting too much, of losing her hard-won independence. But Thomas had been careful to put the house in her name, to make it clear this was hers, not a loan or a gift that came with strings attached. He visited every day. Sometimes he took James to the park or to see the horses. Other times they simply had dinner together, the 3 of them around a table, learning how to be a family. It wasn't easy. There were difficult conversations, moments of tension, old hurts that surfaced unexpectedly. But they were trying. All 3 of them were trying. One evening, after James had gone to bed, Emily and Thomas sat in the small parlor, tea growing cold between them. "Do you think you could ever love me again?" Thomas asked quietly. It was a question he'd been afraid to ask, but it had been weighing on him for weeks. Emily looked at him for a long moment. "I don't know," she said honestly. "I think I never stopped, which is perhaps the problem. But love isn't enough, Thomas. There has to be respect, partnership, equality. I won't be the grateful former maid whose lucky Lord Hargrave deigned to acknowledge her. I would never, Thomas started, then stopped. You're right, I understand. Then that's what I'll work toward. Respect, partnership, equality, for as long as it takes. It might take a very long time. I have time, all the time you need. Emily studied him, and something in her expression softened slightly. Ask me again in a year. I will, and the year after that, and the year after that, if necessary. Emily smiled, small but genuine. Good. The garden behind the house was modest but well kept, with enough space for James to run and play. Early autumn had arrived, painting the world in shades of gold and amber. Thomas arrived to find James racing around the garden, engaged in an elaborate game that seemed to involve sticks as horses and a great deal of running. The boy was talking a mile a minute, narrating his adventure to an audience of no one. Emily sat on a bench near the house, mending clothes in the fading light, watching James with a soft smile. "Papa!" James spotted Thomas and ran over, waving a piece of paper. "Papa, look what I drew." Thomas knelt to examine it, 3 stick figures holding hands, standing in front of a house. The detail was crude, but the meaning was clear. "This is wonderful," Thomas said, genuinely moved. "Is this us?" "It's our family," James explained proudly. "Mam said families look different for everyone. Some have a mam and a papa who live together, and some have a mam and a papa who live in different houses. Ours is just ours." Thomas looked up at Emily, who met his gaze. Her expression was complicated, still wary, still cautious, but with warmth underneath. They were getting there. Slowly, painfully, but they were getting there. "Papa, Mam, come help me," James called, already running back toward his game. "I'm building a fort and I need architects. That's people who design buildings," he added importantly. Emily rose, setting aside her sewing. She and Thomas walked toward their son together, not touching, but side by side, sharing the same space, the same purpose. "He forgives easily," Emily said quietly. "Children do." "And you?" Thomas asked, hardly daring to hope. "I'm working on it. Ask me again in a year." "I will. And the year after that, and the year after that." Emily glanced at him, the smallest smile playing at her lips. "Good." They reached James, who immediately put them to work, gathering sticks and leaves for his imaginary fort. The 3 of them knelt in the grass together, and for the first time in 6 years, they were together. A family. Not a perfect family, not a traditional family, but a real one forged through pain, tested by betrayal, built on second chances, and the daily choice to show up, to try, to love despite the hurt. Thomas watched Emily laugh at something James said, saw his son's joy as he explained his elaborate architectural plans, and thought, this is redemption. Not a moment, but a life lived differently. Not a grand gesture, but 1,000 small choices to be present, to be better, to choose love over comfort. The sun was setting, painting the garden in golden light. James's laughter filled the air. Emily's hand brushed Thomas's as they both reached for the same stick, and she didn't pull away immediately. It was enough. For now, it was enough. And tomorrow, Thomas would wake up and make the same choice again. And the day after that, and the day after that, for as long as it took, for the rest of his life. Because this messy, complicated, beautiful family was worth every sacrifice, worth more than reputation, more than comfort, more than anything else in the world. "Higher," James called, pointing to where he wanted them to stack the sticks. "The fort needs to be higher to keep out the dragons." "There are dragons now?" Emily asked, amused. "Of course there are dragons, ma'am. Every good fort has dragons to defend against." Thomas caught Emily's eye, and they shared a smile, tentative, fragile, but real. A beginning. In the golden light of early autumn, 3 people who'd been torn apart by pride and fear and cowardice were slowly, carefully, finding their way back to each other. Not perfect, not easy, but real. And that was enough. If this story of redemption, second chances, and the courage to choose love over pride touched your heart, I'd be so grateful if you'd take a moment to like this video and subscribe to Lyra's Romance Stories. Your support helps me bring more emotional historical romance tales to life. What did you think? Did Thomas deserve Emily's forgiveness? Could you relate to Emily's struggle between protecting her heart and giving James a chance to know his father? Share your thoughts in the comments below. I read every single one, and I love hearing your perspectives on these complex emotional journeys. If you enjoyed James's story and want more tales of Victorian romance, betrayal, and hard-won redemption. Click the bell icon so you never miss a new story. And if you know someone who loves deeply emotional historical romances about flawed characters finding their way back to each other, please share this video with them. Stories like this remind us that it's never too late to choose differently, to be brave enough to face our mistakes, and to fight for the people we love. Thank you so much for spending this time with Thomas, Emily, and James. Their journey may have ended, but more stories of love, loss, and second chances await. Until next time, may your own story be filled with courage, forgiveness, and love that endures.